A very good morning to all seniors and colleagues present here. I, along with my fellow ophthalmologists, we are going to try and acquaint the general ophthalmologist with the various specialized maps and charts that we see in the field of ophthalmology. So hopefully by the end of our talk, we should all have a rough idea about how to read the chart, and we don't need to click pictures and send them on WhatsApp to our colleagues from certain subspecialties. Since the introductions have already been done, I will start with my talk, wherein I will be talking about how to report a Humphrey visual field printout. I have no financial interest to declare, and this is what I will be covering during the course of my talk. Now, what are visual fields? It is the entire area that can be seen when the eye is fixed at a straight point and can be measured by a technique called perimetry. The most common parameters that we know of today are the kinetic and the static parameters, of which the static parameters are the more commonly used ones. These work on the principle of measuring threshold. What is threshold? It is the minimum stimulus which can be detected at a retinal point. This can be measured in both decibels and apostips, with decibel being the unit for retinal sensitivity and apostips being the unit for the intensity of the stimulus. So, needless to say, as the retinal sensitivity goes up, the requirement for stimulus intensity goes down. So, this is a very important concept to understand. So, we measure the threshold values at every point on the retina to see if there is a visual field effect. The most commonly used static parameters as of today in India are the Humphrey and the Octopus parameters, of which Humphrey is the gold standard, and that is why I have concentrated my talk on this. Before we start reporting a test, we need to know how to order a test. So when we tell the parametrist, we need to tell them the strategy to be used. Full threshold and CETA should be the most commonly used strategies, with CETA fast and faster keep being reserved for very old patients or very young patients wherein the attention span may be shorter. SWAP is used for detecting early glaucomatous changes. After that, we need to tell the parametrist the kind of program that we want to be done. This depends on the kind of visual field defect that we're expecting and the area that we want to test. So a 30-2 field tests the central 30 degree of the field. A 24-2 will test the central 24 degrees. A 10-2 will test the central 10 degrees. And the macular protocol will test only the central 5 degrees of the visual field. Unless we mention the stimulus size and color, the default that is done is using a Goldman size 3 white color stimulus. And if the patient's vision is very poor, or if we are doing a swap analysis, then a stimulus size 5 is used. Now, this is what the printout looks like. I've divided it into 9 different zones, and I'll be talking about every zone separately. Now, the first zone covers the patient details and the test details. So here, we start with the name and the ID of the patient for proper identification. The next, always make sure the correct eye has been tested. Then age is important for proper comparison with the normative data, and also because after the age of 20 years, there's a 1 decibel depreciation in the threshold values for every 10 years. Pupil diameter is very important and should be between 3 and 5 millimeters. Anything less than that can cause edge defects or can cause a generalized depression of sensitivity. Visual acuity should be recorded, and any refractive error should be corrected. After that, we look at the test details, wherein we see the strategy that has been used, the program that has been used, and the stimulus size and color. Zone 2 covers the reliability indices, wherein we check the foveal threshold. Now, if the patient's vision is good, but the foveal threshold is poor, that could be because of a macular disease. And if the patient's vision is poor with a good foveal threshold, then there's a refractive error that needs to be corrected. Fixation losses of up to 20% are considered permissible, and false positive and negative errors of up to 15% are considered permissible with the CETA test, and up to 33% are permissible with the full threshold test. Zone 3 shows us the raw numeric sensitivities at all points, which are then plotted to give us the grayscale image, which shows us a general trend. Never use this for the purpose of diagnosis, but this can be used to explain it to the patient. For residents, when you look at the various grayscales, you should be able to tell which one is which, because 30-2 and 10-2 look very similar, the only difference being the presence of the blind spot. The total deviation plot is what the fifth zone covers, which gives us a numerical plot and a probability plot. This area shows us the generalized depression of sensitivity. And the sixth zone is a modification of the total deviation plot and shows us any localized loss of sensitivity. Zone 7 covers the global indices, wherein we have the mean deviation, which is an aggregate of all the values on the total deviation map. The pattern deviation, which gives us tells us about any change in the contour of the hill of vision. So mean deviation tells us about any generalized depression, and pattern standard deviation tells us about any localized depression. And the visual field index, which correlates very well with the ganglion cell layers of the retina. So a value of 100% means completely normal fields, and a value of 0% means complete blindness on that particular parameter. Zone 8 covers the glaucoma hemifield test, which compares the superior and the inferior fields, and mirror image areas are compared. So this can be reported as outside normal limits, borderline, a general depression of sensitivity, abnormally high sensitivity, or within normal limits. The last zone, or zone 9, covers the gaze tracker. Here, the lines going upwards show us the amount of deviation that has occurred during the test, and the lines going downwards tell us about the times when fixation could not be monitored. Besides this, we also need to know the Anderson's criteria. What are these? 3 or more congruous non-edge points in the typical arc weight area depressed to a p-value of less than 5%, and at least 1 point depressed to a p-value of less than 1%, a pattern standard deviation or a corrected pattern standard deviation with a p-value of less than 5%, and glaucoma hemifield test outside normal limits. This must be demonstrated on at least 2 consecutive fields. So when we look at a visual field report, we start with asking ourselves, is this reliable? So yes, this is reliable. So it doesn't need to be repeated. Are the tests within normal limits? Here, there is a scotoma on the total deviation curve plot. There is a scotoma on the pattern deviation plot. The Anderson's criteria are all followed. So definitely this is not normal. Are these definitive? Can be considered definitive, but can we say that this patient has glaucoma? No, we cannot. Never comment on a visual field report unless you've clinically seen the patient. And even then, whenever there is any kind of doubt, always repeat the fields to make sure that the modified Anderson's criteria are followed in the follow-up fields also. So when we look at this field, we look at the reliability indices which look okay. Anderson's criteria are not followed, and everything else looks fine. So it is safe to say that this is a normal visual field report. Here, 2 out of 3 of the modified Anderson criteria are followed, and there is a small paracentral scotoma on the total deviation plot, which remains on the pattern deviation plot. So we can suspect early glaucomatous damage here, but clinical correlation is very important. Here again, we see a small scotoma, which presents both in the total deviation as well as the pattern deviation plots. It follows the horizontal midline and is present in the nasal area. This is called a nasal step, and is also one of the features we see in early glaucomas. Here we have the clinical picture. There is an inferior notch with a coinciding RNFL defect. And when we look at the fields, they are reliable, and there is a superior arc weight defect. Modified Anderson's criteria also followed. So it is safe to say that this field defect could be because of glaucoma, but it is safe to get at least 1 follow-up field before we know for sure. This report shows us a superior arc weight with a small inferior nasal step. Here, in this, we see a superior arc weight defect with a small area of sparing in the temporal region. This again is very typical of glaucomas. Here, there is a double arc weight scotoma. Why have we called it an advanced double arc weight? Because the scotoma is coming very close to the point of fixation. Now, this is what is important to remember. Never comment on fixation on a 30-2 or a 24-2 field. Always make sure you get a 10-2 field. So here, we thought that fixation was involved, but when a 10-2 field was done for the same patient, we realized that fixation has been spared. Another method to check for fixation, to check whether there is a macular split or not, is by getting a macular threshold done. Here, if one of the 4 central points is a single digit number, as is seen here, with at least one adjacent value of 0, we can safely say that there is a split fixation. When you split fixation on a stimulus 3 test, repeat the test with a stimulus size 5. Why is this important? To explain the prognosis to the patient, or before surgery to prognosticate for your own self. Here there is a bad total deviation plot which has progressed with time, but the pattern deviation plot remains normal. And the patient is 79 years old. So this is probably because of a progressing cataract. In this image, the patient underwent cataract surgery and there was an improvement in the total deviation plot with no change in the pattern deviation plot, which probably was because he had a coexisting glaucoma along with the cataract. Coming next to neurological fields, patients with optic neuritis typically present with central or centrocecal scotomas. In optic disc edema, depending on the stage at which visual fields are done, you can have an enlargement of the blind spot, you can have a large nasal defect, you can have generalized constriction of the field or severely depressed fields, as we see here. Chiasmal lesions typically give rise to bitemporal hemianopias. Once we go posterior to the chiasma, the lesions that we get are homonymous in nature. And the more posterior that we go, the more congruous these become. So the more posterior that we go, the more similar they look on both sides. So temporal lobe lesion typically gives rise to a pie in the sky appearance, and a parietal lobe lesion gives rise to a pie in floor appearance. And as I mentioned earlier, a visual cortex lesion will give rise to a homonymous hemianopia. It is also important to know about all the artifacts that can occur on the field while performing the test. So we see this patient, the pattern deviation has improved. So does that mean that this patient's glaucoma is reversing? No, not at all. Always remember there is a learning curve, and most patients take up to 2 to 3 tests to be able to understand how to do the test properly. So here we actually see there's a low test reliability in the first field, which improves in the second field. Now this was a young, healthy patient who had gotten her fields done, and the perimetrist came running to me and said that, "Madam, ye nahi dekh pa rahi hai." When I examined the patient, she had a moderate scotoma. We taped her eyelid and repeated the test, and it was normal. So always remember, make sure if the patient has ptosis, make up for that by probably taping the eyelid. I mentioned earlier, it's very important to know about the patient's refractive error. Besides preventing any generalized depression of fields, it is also because very high refractive errors can give rise to trial lens artifacts. So for patients with very high refractive errors, it is better to get them to wear a contact lens, And last but not the least, the cloverleaf pattern, which is seen in patients with very high false negative errors. So here what probably has happened is in the initial part of the test, so you can see the initial test points that have been tested. In the initial parts of the test, the patient was very attentive, but lost attention as time progressed. So if you see something of this sort, this is called a cloverleaf pattern. Always tell your patient to come back again in a well-rested state, probably at a time when your clinic is not very busy, so that the patient can do the test aram se. And no mention of visual fields is complete without talking about the Advanced Vision Analyzer, or the AVA, which is a portable visual field analyzer. And the advantage that it has is that the report is very similar to the Humphrey perimetry. So for the clinician, the learning curve will not be very steep. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nupur. It was a really great session, and thank you for finishing it in time. We highly appreciate that. For a Q&A and question and answer round, if time permits, at the end, we'll have a question and answer round. So all these panelists, if you have any questions, please do drop in the chat box or the Q&A box. We'll definitely take all the questions at the end of the session. All right, with this, let's go ahead with Dr. Kirti Wali. Are you there?
Okay. I'm sorry, Prasad. We'll have Dr. Lakshmi present the next talk.
Okay, no problem. Let's go ahead with Dr. Lakshmi.
Okay, shall I share my screen now?
Yes, Dr. Lakshmi, please go ahead.
Awesome. Okay. Just 1 second. Yes. So, good morning, everybody. My topic is Isn't This Great? RNFL OCT. I have no financial disclosures to make. So typically glaucoma has been diagnosed traditionally by these three methods using fundus photography or fundus evaluation, disc evaluation. Then we have applanation tonometry. Then we have visual field defects that Dr. Nupur Rana explained very well. But there's a new player in town, and that's OCT. So why is OCT important? We have to understand that perimetry is the loss of functional vision. It denotes that, and OCT denotes the structural damage, and the structural damage precedes that of functional loss of vision by about 6 years. And during that time, about 35 to 50% of RNFL is already lost. That's a very big loss. So that's the main use of OCT in diagnosis of pre-perimetric glaucoma. As in, if we see a doubtful case and visual field defect is not there, even then it can be glaucomatous and we can diagnose it using RNFL OCT. And it differentiates glaucoma from no glaucoma. If an RNFL OCT is normal, then the chances of it being glaucomatous is very, very less. And it can monitor the progression in glaucoma. It has two extreme advantages, that is, it is very quick and very less cooperation is required. Is somebody saying something?
Add image.
Dr.
Okay.
Lakshmi, do one thing. If the slide is not moving, could you please restart the session, restart the file? Yeah, it's working, I guess, now.
Yeah, it had just stopped. I don't know what happened. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that is happening. The issue is happening. We'll check with. There is a technical error, I guess.
Okay. So as I was saying, it has distinct uses and advantages. So the OCTs that we use in glaucoma are RNFL OCTs and ganglion cell and macular OCTs. But the ganglion cell layer analysis is not done so much simply because it is a very sensitive test, as in it can diagnose glaucoma, but it's not a very specific test for glaucoma. Now coming to the topic at hand, RNFL OCT. It can be a time domain OCT or a spectral domain or a swept source OCT. It can be any of these platforms, various platforms that we have, and all of these gives rise to all these colorful printouts with a lot of data on it. We have to remember that all data are similar. Each of them have specific use, and if we know what is the use of each one, we can actually diagnose glaucoma. A printout can be divided into 7 zones. I will be explaining each of the zones in detail now. So the zone 1 is the introductory data. The age and sex part is more important because it compares it with the normative data. Then we have the signal strength, that is very important. Signal strength is displayed in the printout in the topmost portion of Cirrus OCT and Heidelberg and Avanti OCT. It's different for different devices. If it is more than 6, it is normal in Cirrus OCT. If it is more than 35, it's a reliable test. But in Heidelberg and Revo FC OCT, it is something that is displayed while taking the OCT, so we have to keep that in mind. Then we have the tabular data charts. It can be an RNFL data and ONH data that is displayed in the center. So basically the first thing that we see in this is the color coding. If there are red colors, the hot colors, yellow and red colors in both the RNFL data as well as ONH data, that means that it's abnormal. It can be glaucomatous. And cold colors like green and white means that it's normal. So The second thing that we have to know is the symmetry. If the symmetry is more than 80% or 0.8, that means it's good symmetry. The chance of it being glaucomatous is less. Then there is one more point that is present in Revo FC OCT, that is DDLS scoring. Anything more than 5 and asymmetrical is abnormal. So RNFL thickness map looks something like this in this position. The color coding is given on the left side. The hot colors are thicker and normal. The cooler the colors are, it is abnormal. It has a typical bow tie pattern, can be bifid, which is normal. Then we come to RNFL thickness deviation map. So this map, signification map, is a black and white map which shows the color coding, that is, if it's reddish or yellowish in color, it's borderline or abnormal. If it's no color, as in this case, it's normal. This is clearly abnormal. Then testnet graphs. The graphs are plotted according to the quadrants, and if it's in the red zone, it is abnormal. Yellow zone, borderline, green, it should be in the green area. And there is a central part to it where it overlaps both the eyes. We can see in the topmost portion it is symmetrical. It should be symmetrical in both eyes for it. The chances of it being glaucomatous are less. If it's asymmetrical like this with more dips down, the chance of it being abnormal are more. Then we have the circular graphs. It's just the pie chart pattern for both the quadrants as well as clock hour areas. And we see whatever zone is red and yellow is abnormal. Next, we come to the tomograms that are displayed in the bottommost portion. So in these tomograms, we have to look at these red and green lines. The red line marks the ILM. The green line marks the Bruch's membrane. So our OCT should come in between these two lines, and there should always be a cup displayed, and we should see how deep the cup is. In Cirrus OCT, 3 of the tomogram images are seen. So we can use this glaucoma RNFL OCT for guided progression analysis. If we use the progression program that is there, all we have to see is in the repeated OCTs if a yellow zone is coming on and if it's changing it to red. If it is changing into red, that means that we have to start the patient on glaucoma therapy ASAP. Now we have some artifacts that are displayed on RNFL thickness map, and these are unreliable and cannot be used. So involuntary saccade defects, they are seen as these black patches. Blink artifacts are seen as these smudgy areas with overlapping places. These are unreliable. Next, we come to segmentation error. As I said, the yellow line should be in between that of red and green line. So if the line, it is seen as a purple line in case of Cirrus OCT. We see here that it's in the topmost portion and it's going beyond the green line down. So that means it's a segmentation error. It's not a reliable OCT. Then we have this OCT where there is no cup displayed. So it's not the right area of imaging. There is a segmentation error. Then we have errors in reading wherein we can classify it as false negatives and false positives. False negatives can be eliminated by repeating the scans, and false positives can be eliminated by knowing the normative data. So we need to know what the normative data is fed into the machine. Age should be more than 18 years. Refractive errors should be myopics less than -8 and hyperopes less than +6. And fundus pictures shouldn't have a peripapillary atrophy or an unusually very large deep cup. Those are not in the normative data. So now we have an OCT. Let's just read it. Let me have just 30 seconds more. I'll just take 30 seconds more. So all the initial introductory data are seen here. In the charts, I see red parts are only in the ONH parameters and not in the NFL parameters. But inter-eye symmetry is 0.5. So it's very, very less. So it's less than 0.8. So it can be glaucomatous. DDLS scoring shows 9. It's abnormal. The NFL thickness shows cooler colors and NFL signification has reddish areas. The same is depicted in testnet graphs in the inferior quadrant. The cup is quite deep on the tomograms. There is no segmentation error in the right eye as compared to the left eye. So we can say that this can be a glaucomatous printout, but we have to always correlate clinically to make sure that we are right in diagnosing a case of glaucoma. Thank you very much for listening to the presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lakshmi, and thank you so much for keeping it on time. I would request Dr. Nupur to please invite our next.
Yeah, she's muted.
Thank
Am I
you.
audible?
Thanks, Dr. Lakshmi. Next, we have Dr. Puneet Islur, who is going to talk to us about, I don't know, a mirage or something.
Am I audible?
Over to you,
Good
Dr.
morning,
Puneet.
everybody. Am I audible?
Yes, Dr.
Yes.
Puneet, you are audible.
Okay, thank you. I'll share my screen now.
Dr. Puneet, go ahead. We can see
Yeah.
the screen.
So I've been talking about the retina OCT, interpretation of fluid in the retina OCT, particularly at the macula. So let's start with the basics first. This is anatomy of the cone cell, as you can see here. So it has an outer segment and an inner segment, as you can see here. And the outer segment and the inner segment has two portions, the ellipsoid as well as the myoid zone. This is the nucleus of the cell and this is the axons. Now apply the same thing to the OCT here. So this outermost hyperreflective or white layer is called as the RPE. And after that comes the COST or the cone outer segment tips. That comes the cone outer segment tips. Am I audible clearly?
Yes, Dr.
Am I
Puneet,
audible
you're
clearly?
Yes, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Okay, so this is the cone outer segment tips, which corresponds to this portion. Then you have one more white line, which is the ellipsoid portion of the inner segment, which is this. Okay, and then we have the external limiting membrane. So this is the outer retina. The importance of this area is if there's any pathology here, it significantly affects the visual outcome. Okay, then coming to the inner retina, so we have the hyperreflective and hyporeflective layers. So all the hyporeflective layers are nuclear layers, whereas all the hyperreflective or the white layers are plexiform layers. So we have outer nuclear layer, outer plexiform layer, inner nuclear layer, inner plexiform layer. Then we have the ganglion cell layer and the nerve fiber layer. Okay, so the nerve fiber layer is always thicker on the nasal side. So when you're seeing a printout, if the thicker NFL falls on your right side, it is the OCT scan of the right eye. If it falls on your left side as you visualize the printout, then it is the left eye. So this is a simple trick to identify if it's the right or the left. So why it is important to know what is the inner and the outer retina? Because there are certain pathology that begin in the inner retina and certain pathology that are typically localized or begin in the outer retina. So I have listed them here for your reference. So what is the pathophysiology of fluid in the retina? So anything that causes increased blood pressure can cause increased leakage and increased retinal thickness. Sometimes there's tissue cyst formation, which reduces the retinal tissue pressure. So there's increased leakage from the surrounding vessels. Sometimes traction from the vitreous can cause increased fluid entry into the surrounding tissues. Also, when an RPE pump does not pump out the fluid, there can be accumulation of subretinal fluid. So fluid in the retina can be at two levels. One is subretinal and intraretinal. When I say subretinal, I mean it is between the RPE and the rest of the layers of the retina, like you see in exudative RD and rhegmatogenous RD. When I say intraretinal fluid, I mean it is within the layers of the retina in the form of cysts. So coming to diabetic macular edema, we have mainly intraretinal fluid here in the form of large cysts. So in this case, as you can see here, it responds very well to the anti-VEGF or steroid injection. In some cases, it does not respond at all and it remains as chronic cystoid spaces. This is mainly because of inflammation and vascular leakage. In certain other cases, there is traction by the vitreous. So in such cases also, the fluid does not respond to anti-VEGF. We have to do a vitrectomy to relieve this traction so that the edema reduces. Okay, so this is also an epiretinal membrane which causes traction on the cystoid spaces here. So as a result of which, even if you give an anti-VEGF, it is not going to respond. The culprit is the ERM. It has to be removed surgically. So coming to vein occlusions, here we have the typical cystoid macular edema, where you have both intraretinal fluid as well as subretinal fluid. So the intraretinal fluid is in the form of this well demarcated cysts with septa, and subretinal fluid below it is seen here. So these sort of edemas respond very well to steroids and anti-VEGF. You will also see them in pseudophakic cystoid macular edema post-cataract surgery, or which is also called as Irwin gas. Okay, Irwin gas is sometimes missed on a 90-day examination, so you may need to do an OCT if you don't see visual improvement after cataract surgery. So this is another patient where you think it is a vein occlusion, but when you do the OCT at the macula, you find this inner white hyperreflectivity of the inner retina. So this means it's an ischemic inner retina with retinal edema. So this is seen in CRAO or combined occlusion, that is artery plus vein occlusion. So you can pick up a combined occlusion on this OCT scan because of this inner hyperreflectivity. In central serous retinopathy, there is no vascular leakage from the retinal vessels. Hence, you do not find intraretinal fluid. You will find only subretinal fluid. Sometimes you may find a pigment epithelial detachment. Okay, and it is because of RPE dysfunction as well as leak from the choroidal vessels. In patients with, if you're planning for a multifocal IOL and other high-end premium IOLs, it's better always to do an OCT preoperatively. You may, because you will miss out foveal thinning. So if you see foveal thinning, you can counsel the patient for other normal IOLs, or you can give them guarded visual prognosis. In case there's a posterior subcapsular cataract, so you will get a scan like this, a raster scan. So in such cases, it's better to do a line scan of a single cross section so that you get a better area, better resolution to identify if there's any pathology. Sometimes what you can do is, if your cataract is blocking your OCT acquisition, you can get around the cataract and take a better image. This depends on the skill of the person or the technician who is doing it. So you can just focus it a little around and you can get a very good quality image to know if the retina is okay prior to cataract surgery. So in coming to age-related macular degeneration, you find this lumpy, bumpy RPE. Sometimes you see yellowish lesions on fundus examination. You're not sure if it's a hard exudate or if it's a drusen. If it's a hard exudate, it will normally be present at this level, whereas drusen are present as lumps or bumps in the RPE. A bumpy RPE suggestive of drusen. If they are more than 350 microns, they are known as drusenoid pigment epithelial detachments. Now coming to what is a pigment epithelial detachment? It is a separation of the RPE from the Brooks. Normally the RPE and Brooks are, they appear as a single layer. So when there's a gap in between these two, this is known as a pigment epithelial detachment. There are mainly three types: serous, drusenoid, and fibrovascular. So in serous, there's an optically empty space below the RPE. In drusenoid PED, they appear as drusen, and you can see it as a homogeneous reflectivity below the drusen. Whereas in a fibrovascular PED, you will find a heterogeneous reflectivity below the PED. Okay, and this is a CNVM, or a choroidal neovascular membrane, which secretes fluid, intraretinal fluid, also subretinal fluid in the retina. So this is a fibrovascular PED. So then this is a CNVM with intraretinal fluid which has responded to anti-VEGF. This is a CNVM with subretinal fluid which has responded to anti-VEGF. So you can find both of them in age-related macular degeneration. Coming to polypoidal choroidal vasculopathy, so you will find thumb-shaped PEDs here and subretinal fluid. You will also find the double layer sign. That is, you will find a layer of blood vessels between the RPE and the Brooks membrane. So this is called as the double layer sign. It's a very important sign in IPCE. Okay, so coming to VKH, inflammatory pathogens, Vogt-Koyanagi-Harada syndrome. So you will find undulating or a wavy RPE. You will find multiple pockets of subretinal fluid. You will not find intraretinal fluid generally, and you will find septae in the subretinal fluid. So this is very typical of VKH, and you can diagnose it on OCT. And coming to one more important aspect, that is MACTEL. So in MACTEL type 2 or juxtafoveal telangiectasia, I'll be finishing it quickly. We have cavitations or loss of retinal tissue spaces here with the ILM draping over it. This is called as the ILM drape sign. You also have the collapse of the inner retinal layers here. Okay, you can see that there's loss of outer retinal layers, so the inner retinal layers appear to be collapsed downwards. You will also find RPE migration here with back shadowing. So these are the features of MACTEL, and we must learn to pick it up preoperatively. One thing about Mactel is it is almost bilateral always, though it may be present to different extents in both the eyes. So that gives you a clue if there is Mactel or not. There are some conditions where you find fluid in the retina, but they do not leak on angiography. This is because mainly the RPE is not functioning and is not pumping out the normal fluid. You will see it in retinitis pigmentosa, macular dystrophies, and X-linked retinoschisis. So this is a patient with cystoid spaces in retinitis pigmentosa. This will not respond to anti-VEGFs or steroids. This is one more patient who was misdiagnosed as a CNVM, an old lady. But actually what happens is she has these yellowish lesions. If you look on the OCT, you find this subretinal white hyperreflective material in both the eyes. And if you do an autofluorescence, you will find hyperautofluorescence. This is actually an adult macular dystrophy or a foveal vitelliform dystrophy. So this is another thing to be kept in the back of your mind. These are rarer diagnoses, but this will help you. It's very easy to pick them up if you have seen them up once. Then this is a case of X-linked retinoschisis, which is seen in younger patients. So you will find a Scheitic fovea here. So I would like to conclude my talk by saying it's important for us to identify if it's intraretinal or subretinal fluid. It goes a long way in helping coming at the right diagnosis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Puneet. I would request Dr. Nupur to please invite our next speaker.
Thank you. We next have Dr. Ronak, who is going to talk to us about the anterior segment OCT. Over to you, Dr. Ronak.
Dr. Ronak, you're on mute. Please unmute yourself. Dr. Ronak, if you can hear us, please unmute yourself. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me? Is my screen visible?
Yes.
So I'm going to be talking about anterior segment OCT. So the outline for my talk is basically a small introduction in the principle of ASOCT, the different types of machines available, why it should be your first investment soon in your own practice, and the various different clinical applications and future devices and latest devices. Basically, OCT is a non-contact imaging technology that provides detailed cross-sectional images of the internal structures in the eyes. It helps in your diagnosis, surgical planning, and decision-making, along with monitoring of the treatment. Based on the Michelson's interferometer, the principle of Michelson interferometry is to compare a partially coherent reference beam to another one from a reflected tissue. These are the various machines available. Some of them are time domain. As time has passed, we have shifted to spectral domains, and there are swift source OCTs in the form of Cassia available, which is the latest device. The advantage of an anterior segment OCT is its high spatial resolution. It's a non-contact device performed with the patient sitting up. Image acquisition is rapid, and it can be viewed in time and recorded for monitoring purposes. Various scanning modes are for your various pathologies, like an HD scan provides a scan through the same area and improves the resolution. Pachymetric has a radial scan so that a diffuse area can be measured. Why should one invest in an OCT? Is because it helps in diagnosing your retinal conditions, your glaucoma, cornea, refractive surgery, and an anterior segment imaging. It's a revenue generating tool and aids in clinical diagnosis and management. So nowadays, these OCT machines have an anterior segment and a posterior segment built into one, like your Topcon or Spectralis. Let's come to the clinical application of anterior segment OCT in the pathologies. The most important tissue that we need to assess is the cornea, where you can, find out scars, opacity, the graft assessment, and pre and post-op planning, infectious keratitis, Descemet membrane detachments, keratoconus, surface lesions like pterygium, limbal dermoids, OSSN, and your dystrophies and degeneration. So how does a normal anterior segment OCT look like? There's basically a first layer of the tear film, which is a hyperreflective layer, which overlies a band of an hyporeflective layer, which is the normal corneal epithelium. And there is an underlying variable hyperreflectivity of the corneal stroma and the endothelium, which is a hyperreflective tissue. Coming to scars and opacity, like for example, in this case, if you could see, there is a full thickness scar and then involvement of the endothelium also. So it's better to plan a posterior segment, a penetrating graft than a full endothelial keratoplasty or something like that. Depth of the stomal scar also helps in assessment. and monitor and take treatment decisions wisely, whether you want to do a DALC or a superficial lamellar keratoplasty or a full thickness keratoplasty. For example, a case which was referred where there was a ballpoint cautery burned by a resident during SICS training. On ASOCT, we could see a deep stromal scarring and an endothelial involvement. So in this case, preferably a penetrating keratoplasty would be better than a DALC, in spite of, a very focal area of involvement. This patient was referred to me for a penetrating keratoplasty, where the referring surgeon thought it was a full thickness stromal involvement. But on doing an ASOCT, you can clearly see that there is a superficial epithelial hyperplasia, and this patient was therefore advised debridement, and we had assessed him later. Some patients who have very thick corneas, like a long-standing corneal edema, this shows diffuse scarring, and there is no edema in this. This is mostly a scarred tissue. So therefore, this patient won't benefit from an endothelial keratoplasty. So basically, in scar management, the superficial scars are treated with peeling and PTK, and deeper lesions may be treated by keratoplasty. In your pre-op graft assessment, you have depth and extent of opacities, thinning, retrocorneal membranes, pannus, antersegment abnormalities, and your failed grafts. In post-keratoplasty, after you have done your surgery, you can always check for graft host apposition, pachymetry, interface problems, residual thickness. And in endothelial keratoplasty, you can look for detachments, dislocations, and apposition of the graft. It's a case where there is a spur on the posterior ledge. So this was actually a 6.5 to 7 mm optical keratoplasty done, which was eccentric in position. Looking at the posterior ledge, we decided not to do an endothelial keratoplasty in the form of DMEC or DSEC, and a PK was done for better visual outcome. The case of an apical scar in keratoconus, where the apical scar was not involved in the deeper layer, and therefore a manual DALC could be performed instead of a full thickness graft, just based on the depth assessment. In DALC, you then, or any other graft, you just basically have to see for the pachymetry, the graft clarity, the graft host junction, the Descemet membrane, and the interface. In this, you can see there was a double bubble AC formed, but which resolved over time. The attachment of the grafts, you can see. In an DSEC, you have an acute angle Biveld sign, where in the edge of the graft, there's an acute angle formed. This is actually described as an intraoperative ASOCT by Dr. Narmata Sharma and all, but it can be used to assess the orientation in a hazy cornea post-op also. Monitoring of the grafts pre and post-op. On day one, if you see the graft is a very thick graft because of the long-standing edema and the storage medium involved. And over time, it resolves and the graft clarity improves, and the pachymetry and graft thickness also reduces. Some cases they fail. So therefore, when a failed graft, the reduction of pachymetry and the clarity of the graft will not be seen. So you can easily monitor and assess. A new thing which was done previously was an infectious keratitis, especially in cases where there is smear negative cultures and you want to objectively monitor the treatment response, because you're going to give a cocktail therapy or you're based on your clinical judgment. So in this case, for example, this was a culture negative case which was responding to antifungal. On presentation, it shows a corneal thickness and an infiltrate thickness which we measured. And subsequently at 3rd week and 6th week, when you keep measuring, the response to treatment is analyzed with the help of saying that the corneal thickness has reduced and the infiltrate thickness has also reduced and eventually turned into a scar. Based on this study which we had done, there was a recommendation made that the thickness of more than 230 microns should be taken as a red flag sign, and other modalities of treatment should be added. In pseudophakic bullous keratopathy, you can check for scarring, thickness, and areas of focal DM loss or tear. It helps you to decide what kind of keratoplasty you want to do, or you want to still be on conservative management if it's in the initial stages. Like a pachymetry of 1000 won't help in endokeratoplasty. This case I had previously shown, this is a scarred cornea, not an edematous cornea. So an endothelial keratoplasty will not benefit. Pterygioms, OSSN, and limbal dermoids, you can keep assessing the surface regularity, the epithelialization. In OSSN, you can clearly see that there is a specific sign where there is a hyperreflective epithelium and an abrupt transition zone from normal to abnormal epithelium. This is the pre and post-treatment photograph where treatment response to the medical management in the form of interferons is seen. No need for surgical intervention as of now in this case. Dermoids, the extent of the dermoid and the deeper involvements. Another very important thing to see is your Descemet membrane detachment cases. There are various algorithms and classifications based on OSCT. So in Descemet membrane detachment, it is important to see the post-tamponade pachymetry and attachment and clarity of the graft. So based on OCT, there is a treatment protocol made where, depending on the local configuration, just 1 minute more, you can use the type of tamponade agent and show how it is done. You can see the pre and post-op pictures after treatment. Then you have your corneal dystrophies. Basically, in dystrophies, more than diagnosing them, if you can see, there are various levels of involvement and there are various features on ASOCT. You can always determine whether you want to do a PTK or PRK based on the depth of involvement. Intrastromal foreign bodies, exact depth and area can be seen. The back shadow actually here mimics a perforation, but it's not a perforation. This is an artifact, if you can go. Then there is tear film assessment, where you can see the tear film height, which is reduced in dry eye cases. In refractive surgery, you can do epithelial assessment, flap assessment, smile cases, and if you want to do retreatments based on the depth of the flap. These are the characteristic planar and meniscus flap of the LASIK flaps. There is something called as interface fluid syndrome, which can be detected and monitored over time during treatment. Retained smile lenticle, which can be manually removed based on the extent and depth of the involvement. You can see your demarcation line, just 30 seconds more. A lot of pachymetric parameters, epithelial mapping you can do, but most importantly to be seen is a cross-linking of the stromal demarcation line. Intacs also help where you want to monitor post-operatively decompensation, migration, and perforations. Then you come to phakic IOL, where you need to see for the vaulting and the shallowing of the angles and positioning. In cataract surgery, you can see a phaco wound architecture, something like a capsular distension syndrome, where there is fluid behind the IOL. And in glaucoma angle assessment, you can see the virtual biopsy of the plateau iris, pachymetry for IOP. You can see the pictures, there's narrowing of the angles, some post-op pictures, plateau iris configuration, reverse pupillary blocks, the various angle opening distances and measurements which you can do for objective assessment, bleb characteristics, and also other associated patterns. Newer devices are Antirion, which is basically a biometer, topographer, and an ASOCT. If you can see in this application, the sky is the limit. You can do everything in this one scan, one machine. There's a future of Cassia where there is 3D imaging reconstruction also, which can be done. So basically, in summary, OCT is applicable to assess a wide variety of corneal and anterior-segment conditions, revolutionize the ability to examine the anterior chamber cornea and surrounding areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ronak. Dr. Nupur, are you there? Yes, Dr. Nupur. May I request you to please invite the next speaker?
Thank you, Dr. Ronak. We now have Dr. Kirti, who's going to talk to us about how to analyze a pentacam printout. Over to you, Dr. Kirti.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nupur. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Kirti Wali, presenting you to how to read the pentacam today. As you know, normal cornea is a prolate ellipsoid, which means the curvature is higher in the center as we go to the periphery. I'm sorry, the timer is showing 8 minutes, but I was
sorry. I'll check with the AV team. There is some technical glitches. You're allotted 15 minutes. You will get the 15 minutes. Don't worry. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so as we go from the apex to the limbus, the curvature flattens. Pentacam is a modern corneal tomogram which uses the Schleimpflug camera principle to take the anti-segment images and gives us the corneal tomography, which is a format display. When we see this report, it shows us the corneal parameters on the right hand side and the format composite map on our right hand side and corneal parameters on our left side. So the first thing we have to see is the QS, that's a quality specification, which has to be okay. And below that, a Q value of the cornea showing the asphericity of the cornea is shown, which is measured over the 8 mm zone. And the first zone in this shows us the K1, K2 and the mean K, Km. This is important to plan the refractive surgeries because in myopic patients, one diopter correction flattens the cornea by 0.8 diopters, and in hyperopic, one diopter steepens by 1.2 diopters. So the post-refractive surgery keratometry has to be more than 34 and less than 49. So that is why this is important. And Km is important because there is a high risk of free flap if the Km is less than 40 diopters, and a high risk of buttonholing if the Km is more than 46 diopters. And in the third section here, we can see the Kmax, maximum keratometry values. This has to be less than 49 diopters. The normal difference between two eyes is less than 2 diopters. And the Kmax and the K2 difference has to be less than 1 diopters. If the difference is more than 1 diopters, then for all the calculations, we have to use Kmax instead of K2. Okay, so in the first section, we also see a topographic astigmatism, and we have to correlate with the manifest astigmatism. If the manifest astigmatism is more than this topographic astigmatism, it indicates there's a lenticular astigmatism, and patient should be told that this astigmatism is going to be remaining even after the refractive surgeries. Okay, the second section shows the similar parameters for the back surface of the cornea, and the third parameter shows the pupil center, the pupil apex, and the thinnest location with their X and Y coordinates. Cornea is referred to be thin cornea if it is less than 470 microns. So any patient shows us the report, even though it is a normal tomography and the corneal thickness is less than 470, then it's not a good candidate for keratorefractive procedures. And if it is less than 500 microns with abnormal topography, then also it's a high risk case. If the both eye difference is more than 30 microns, it's suspicious of ectatic disease. And if the difference between the pachy-apex and the thinnest location is more than 30 microns, is also suspicious. And we have to see this Y coordinate of the thinnest location. Here it is minus 0.21. If it is more than 0.5, it is suspicious. And if it is more than 1, it is definitely a high risk character. The last section here shows the AC parameters, which is important for planning the phakic IOLs. Coming to the corneal maps, it includes the anterior sagittal map, the anterior elevation map, the posterior elevation map, followed by the pachymetry map. The anterior sagittal map shows the steep areas in the hot colors and the flat areas on the cold colors. We have to see 2 points in the 5 mm zone, which is clinically significant. And if the inferior is steeper by 1.5 diopters than the superior, it is significant, and if the superior is steeper by more than 2.5 diopters, that is a significant value and it indicates a high risk. A normal pattern is a symmetric bow tie as seen on this picture. So any of these features shown in the table, with the thinnest location less than 470, TLY coordinate more than -1, if there's a skewing of radial axis more than 22 degrees, if there's a butterfly, claw, or a D-shaped pattern on the sagittal curvature, if there's a symmetric pattern but more than the steeper than 50 diopters is also a high risk. So some of the sagittal curvature maps we'll see here. This is a round pattern with the apical keratometry range in the range of 50 diopters. This is a high risk feature. This is a superior steep pattern with a superior inferior asymmetry, a high risk feature. This is the inferior steep pattern with the keratometric values in the higher range and inferior asymmetry more than 1.5 diopters. This is a high risk characteristic. This is an irregular pattern, definitely a high risk. This shows a symmetric bow tie with skewing of the radial axis. This comes in the moderate risk. Asymmetric bow tie with inferior steepening is a high risk if associated with keratometry values more than 50. However, this comes in the moderate risk because the keratometric values are not so much. Okay. This shows the asymmetric bow tie with superior steepening. This shows the asymmetric bow tie with skewing of the radial axis, characteristic of keratoconus. This is a butterfly pattern, characteristic of PMD. This is a claw pattern, characteristic of inferior corneal ectasias. And the next map is the elevation map. Elevation maps takes a reference body and gives anything above that point in the cornea as anterior in the plus point and below that as posterior negative points. So we can use multiple type of reference bodies. The most commonly used are the best fit sphere and the best fit toric ellipsoid. BFS is important for localizing of the cone and BFT is important for seeing the height of the cone. So a normal shape on the BFS float mode is the regular astigmatism, which is symmetric hourglass pattern. Okay, some abnormal shapes include a skewed hourglass a tongue-like extension, okay, and an isolated island in the center. And elevation maps are considered to be high risk if on the best fit sphere float mode in myopic patient, the anterior points are more than 8 and the posterior points, elevation points are more than 18 microns. And in hyperopic, if the anterior is more than 7 microns and posteriorly more than 28 microns. The same thing if it's a best fit toric ellipsoid float mode, the values change. And if the anteriorly, if it is more than 12 microns and posteriorly more than 15 microns, it is high risk. So here you can see both the reference bodies in same patient. As you can see on the left side is the best fit sphere showing the localizing the cone, and in the right side is the best fit toric ellipsoid, which is showing the elevation, the height of the cone. Okay, so BFS is important for cone localization. Right. So coming to the next map, the pachymetric map, it shows the distribution of the corneal thickness throughout the entire corneal diameter, the normal shape being the concentric, and in 5 mm zone, you have to see the inferior and superior thickness at the 5 mm level. The difference should be less than 30 microns. As in this case, it's 534 and 530, the difference is hardly 4 microns. It is not significant. If it is more than 30 microns, it is significant and high risk. Okay, so in this we have to localize the thinness location on X and Y coordinates, and if it is on X coordinate, if it is displaced, it is called a horizontal displacement of thin location. This is abnormal, and the vertically displaced thinness location is also abnormal. This is a bell-shaped pattern seen in pellucid marginal degeneration. Generalized thinning till the limbus is seen in keratoglobus. Okay. Berlin-Ambrosia enhanced ectasia display is a special feature that we get with Pentacam. In this, the Pentacam gives us the elevation maps using the enhanced BFS. This uses the concept of exclusion zone. A 4 mm zone of ectatic cornea is excluded and the elevation maps are given along with this enhanced BFS. So this is how the map looks like. It has got so many components, the maps on the left side and the corneal thickness graphs on the right side. Okay. The first zone in this shows the two elevation map, the front surface and the back surface using the standard best fit sphere. And the second zone, you can see it has given the there is anterior exclusion map and the posterior exclusion map. The third zone has got only 3 colors, green, yellow and red. This gives the difference between the two of them, the superior one and the inferior one, the regular BFS and the enhanced BFS difference. Okay. So the third zone gives us 3 colors, green meaning it's normal, yellow is in the borderline difference, and red showing that it's a pathological change, that magnitude that we typically see in keratoconus patients. Okay, so in this case, you can see that the difference is very significant, and this is made clear cut in the third zone. It is shown by red color. So this is how the Berlin-Ambrosia enhanced ectasia display helps us identify early keratoconus patients. And this also has 2 graphs, which is a corneal thickness spatial profile and the percentage thickness increase profile. Okay, so in this, what we have to see is 3 points. One is the curve, the red line, where it is lying. It has to be lying within 95% confidence interval limits in both the graphs, and the average progression index. The normal values are 0.8 to 1.2. Okay, anything less than 0.8 and more than 1.2 is pathological. Okay, and another thing we have to see is at 6 mm zone where this red line is falling. That is an important thing. This is a normal shape which is lying within the 95% confidence interval and the average of 0.9. Okay, this is an abnormal shape wherein the slope is very quick. It is falling very quickly before even reaching the 6 mm zone. Okay, and here you can see the average is 2.3. This is characteristic of corneal ectasias. This abnormal zone is showing the S shape, and S is happening before reaching the 6 mm. If this S is after 6 mm, it will show a moderate risk, not a high risk. This graph is showing a high risk case with an average of 2.4. Okay, this is a flat shape. This is also abnormal, and this kind of shape is seen in corneal edema secondary to any cause. And the average here will be very low, 0.6, less than 0.8. Okay, this is another abnormal shape which is showing an inverted shape. This is inverted upwards, and the average is in minus. This kind of graph we see in pellucid marginal degeneration. So as I told you, a S-shaped curve after the point of 6 mm is a moderate risk. this has to be monitored. And here you can see the average is pretty normal, 0.8. Okay. The next thing we all see is the keratoconus indices. They are given differently in different machines. And the most important indices among them are the index of surface variance, ISV, index of vertical asymmetry, IVA, and the aberration coefficient, ABR. Okay, we don't have to remember these values because the abnormal values are shown in the report in yellow color and pathological values are marked by red color. So the colors itself will alarm us. Okay, so this is how the Pentacam report, Pentacam report shows us the indices. And in this report, you can clearly see they are marked by red. So you don't have to remember those values, but the color coding itself will give us a red flag sign in your mind. So when we are deciding for a keratorefractive procedure, even if there is one high risk or two moderate risk, it's not a good case for keratorefractive procedures, can consider the lenticular procedures. Or if there is one moderate risk, we can do a PRK, no flap-based procedures. If there are no risks, then we can decide on the PRK or LASIK depending on many other things. Okay, let's go through some of the Pentacam maps now and how to read them. In this map, you can see that the anterior-sagittal map is showing a symmetric bow tie, and the elevation and the posterior, both the elevation anterior and posterior do not have any higher values than +8 or +18, and the curvatural map is showing a concentric ring pattern, which is normal. And you can see the keratometric values are 41 and 44, which shows the astigmatism of 2.8. The thinnest location is 529 microns, which is within the normal range. Okay, so this is a normal cornea showing a with the rule astigmatism. However, this QS factor here, this is indicating that this scan needs to be repeated. Fixation losses were there in the while the study. Pentacam hardly takes 2 seconds to capture this, so it can be repeated. It has to be repeated. If the eye closes or fixation is lost during that time, the QS will be shown like this. Okay, this map is showing a horizontal symmetric bow tie with no significant parameters on the elevation map, both anterior and posterior, and thickness map is also concentric. The thinnest location is 506 and X and Y coordinates less than 0.5. Okay, and everything else is normal, hence it's a simple against the rule astigmatism. This case, you can see that there is a asymmetric bow tie with skewing of the radial axis. Okay, and here you can see some values like +12 and posteriorly +27, +19 in the center on the posterior map. So on the elevation, this is a best fit sphere, BFS, not BFT. On best fit sphere, if it is more than +8 anteriorly, more than +18 posteriorly myopic, it is significant. It is pathological. And here you can see the thinnest location has shifted. It's not in the center. You can see the thinnest location is 598 microns at +1.05 and -0.63. -0.63 on Y coordinate is definitely suspicious, and on X coordinate is definitely a horizontal displacement +1.05. Okay, but the thinnest location is 598 microns. So if this patient comes to us for a refractive procedure, then we have to advise for a serial follow-up. And if it is stable over even 1 year, then we can take them up for a surgery, not otherwise. Otherwise, if there is a progression, then it has to be treated accordingly. This map, hello?
Yes, doctor, continue. We can hear you.
Okay, sir. So this map is showing us, when we see on this map, suddenly at the corneal thickness map, we can see the thickness is 434 and it's in red color. So hot colors. So suddenly we'll feel like, okay, maybe it's an ectatic cornea. But then when we see the elevation map, there are some points +14, +19, which are in the pathological range. But in the posterior, this is not coinciding. Like here it's +4, +5. It's very less. Okay, so this is not coinciding with these values, a suspicion of ectasia. And when we see on the curvature map, it's pretty flat case. Okay, so when such kind of a picture is seen, this kind of flat case are seen post myopia, post myopic LASIK. Okay, when a patient undergoes myopic LASIK, the center becomes flat and this kind of the curvature is seen. And you can see residual astigmatism of -1, vacuum, and the thinnest location is 433. Okay, so this thinning is because of the LASIK, not because of the ectasia. So this is a pentacam showing post-myopic LASIK a normal cornea. Okay, so this is a picture showing post-hyperopic LASIK, wherein it looks like the keratometric values looks pretty normal. Center steep and the periphery is flat. Okay, however, the point indicating the hyperopic LASIK here is, if you see the thinnest location, which is 492 microns, this is decentered totally on both X and Y axis. Okay, so this is an indication that this patient has undergone a hyperopic LASIK. This is a very straightforward map of advanced keratoconus that anyone can understand. The keratometric values are pretty high, 68.3 and 75 diopters, and with a hotspot on a curvatural map, and the elevation points are at plus 97, plus 65, very high, and the posteriorly it is plus 169, very high values, and the thinnest location is 359 microns, but the X and Y coordinates are normal here. So this shows a central advanced cone. Okay, so this is an advanced keratoconus. But our confusion always lies with cases like this. If this patient comes to us for refractive surgery evaluation, when we see these curvatures, it could be simple astigmatism, 44 and 47.1, and we get the pentacam done for them, and we see a symmetric bow tie with superior steepening, which is not significant. The difference is not more than 2.5 diopters here. If you see 46 and 44 and 43.4. Okay, so this is not significant. And on the elevation maps, there are no significant points. On the posterior elevation maps also, there are minus 24 is one point, and plus 15 just borderline, but plus 18 is the pathological, more than plus 18. And the thickness is also normal. The thinnest location is 528, and it is not decentered. Okay, so in these cases, there is a lot of confusion about what to do. And in these cases, Berlin-Ambrosia curve and the indices will help us to see for the risk. Here in Berlin-Ambrosia curve, you can see that after 6 mm zone, there
Dr.
is a
Kirti?
steep fall. Yes.
Dr. Kirti, can you please try and sum it up now?
Sorry?
Can you make it a little faster?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I cannot go to my screen.
Dr. Kirti, could you please start sharing your screen again? And you're 2 minutes late in your section, so I would request you to please sum it up in next 1 minute.
Yes, sir, I'm done in another 2-3 minutes. So here you can see the average is very high, and when we see the topography of the other eye, this shows a clear-cut keratoconus with steep K values and the typical features, and the thinnest location is 502 microns, and on the Berlin-Ambrosia curve, it's a it indicates keratoconus, and the indices are all in the pathological range. So this case definitely needs treatment for keratoconus rather than a refractive procedure. And this is the last map, which shows the keratoconus like picture. When we see on the sagittal curvature, we see a hotspot decentered inferiorly, and the thinnest location is decentered horizontally, and it is 489 microns. Okay, but one thing we see here is the superior keratometric values are very flat, 37.3, 39.8 and all that. So this is an indication that it is a post-LASIK case rather than a simple regular corneal ectasia case. Okay, so this is indication of post-LASIK ectasia. On Berlin-Ambrosia also you can see that the indices are pathological, and there is a S shape and the steep fall in the percentage corneal thickness. Okay, so these are all the this is how pentacam helps us in knowing the high risk and the moderate risk patients for the refractive surgery. Some non-topographic applications are in contact lens fitting, for the scleral lens fitting, for the corneal optical densitometry, for the cataract analysis, for IOL calculations, especially in post-refractive cases. We get a Holliday report that gives us a EKR 65 flattened case. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kirti. Now I would request. All right, can I see all the doctor? All right. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I would request Dr. Nupur to please conclude the session. Also, if anyone is having your questions, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask your questions about any speaker, to any speaker if you have any questions. Please unmute yourself and ask your questions.
Hi. I'm Dr. Ronak. So I wanted to ask actually Dr. Puneet. So basically, as a anterior segment surgeon, when I'm doing premium cataract surgeries, the cataract sometimes is dense enough to not visualize the macula. So what kind of an OCT scan would you suggest where I want to, check the macular status briefly? Like, I may not, because there are cases where you mentioned there will be foveal thinning and then you have to give a guarded prognosis. So sometimes in that multiple scans, the resolution is not very good. So what should you do in those cases?
So I suggest you do a line scan. You have various protocols in the OCT macula. You have a line, you have radial line, and you have raster, which is like a block of tissue, multiple sections. So you take a program which takes a single line across the fovea, so that the resolution is much slightly better, and you're able to see those finer details with some better clarity than raster scan. And if you don't have a good resolution OCT, you can probably send it to another center where they have Heidelberg or something like that, which has a very good resolution. In case you're still planning for a premium IOL and you're not sure about the macular status.
How often would foveal thinning be seen in, routine screening cases? Is it a very occurrence?
No, not very often. But you can see it in old patients. I suggest you check the near vision. And if you feel the near vision is disproportionately low, N36 and less, then I suggest it's better you get it done.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any else having questions? As Dr. Nupur can go ahead and.
Are there any more questions?
No.
I want to ask Dr. Kirti one question. Regarding the Berlin Ambrosio ectasia, so it is only, can you hear me?
I cannot hear you, Dr. Puneet.
Dr. Puneet, could you speak a little louder? Your voice isn't audible.
Am I audible now?
You're audible, but it's not louder. So we have to stretch our ears to the speaker. So if you could be a little louder, that would be
am I audible now?
Yeah.
Very perfect.
Okay. I have just one question. In Berlin Ambrosio ectasia curve, you use it mainly to identify early ectasia, is it? Early keratoconus, formiferste and all that?
Yeah. It gives us a indication of early keratoconus. It makes us more evident on the map. And with using the average values and the at 6 mm point, like I told you, whether the curve is falling steeply after that or below that, we can categorize the patients into moderate and high risk also for screening of refractive surgery.
Do you suggest we just do a Berlin Ambrosio screen itself instead of the other printouts? I found that to be the simplest actually. The Berlin I found Berlin Ambrosio ectasia graph, the printout very good. I found it the most simple one to interpret among all the printouts that you showed me. So do you suggest we can just do that as general ophthalmologists for a screening keratoconus before any procedure, before LASIK or something?
No, it doesn't give all the characteristics. It might just give you an indication whether or not do a surgery, but other things like what it is. Like if you see only Berlin Ambrosio, you cannot differentiate keratoconus from a post-LASIK ectasia. So if the patient has not told you that she has undergone the LASIK surgery before and you have seen this, and suddenly you will be confused if you see Berlin Ambrosio. Both will be seen similarly. So if you do not see the topographic maps and all other maps, you will not understand whether it is post-LASIK or not.
Do we have any more questions?
If there is time, Dr. Nupur, can I ask you one question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so while doing a HFA, regarding the refractive status of the patient, do you give them, how do you put the trial lenses, just as a basic overview for general ophthalmologist, where you have some cylinders?
The HFA machine has a trial frame, and there are large size trial lenses which come with the machine. So you can use those. So they have a very small edge to prevent the trial lens artifact. Besides this, because the test is being done at a 30 centimeter distance, it is very important to give them a near addition also.
So along with the distance, give the full near correction.
Yes. Full near correction has to be given.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I have one small question for Dr. Ronak. Post cataract surgery, if there is a Descemet's detachment, and every patient cannot actually afford OCT. So, when do I actually need to get an AS-OCT done? How long the corneal edema? How do you define the long standing? Say 1 week post-op, if there is edema, do I need to get an OCT done to see if there is still Descemet's detachment? Or 1 day, when? What is the time limit where I should?
So basically, any investigation you do has to be correlated clinically. So basically, if a post cataract surgery, if you know that it's an uneventful surgery, you should not have corneal edema. Where if there's a hard cataract you operated, you expect certain corneal edema and decompensation. But if it's an uneventful surgery and you see a corneal edema, which will usually be a focal patch of edema, it won't be a diffuse edema in cases like how you have in TAS. So if it's a focal edema and you know that the surgery is done by you or it was an uneventful surgery, you see for it clinically. Clinically, you may see an area of Descemet detachment. But to find out the exact extent and how much it is gone, just have to do an OCT. So it's always better to do it on day one itself if you have the imaging modality. You could wait for a few days. If you see that on clinical examination, it's a very shallow Descemet detachment. As you said, in my protocol, I showed a health protocol where the height and the extent of the Descemet detachment determine how you should intervene. Ideally, all cases should be taken up for intervention as soon as possible. If you find it's a large tear or you have scroll formation, or if there is a focal loss of DM, sometimes just because of manipulation, like in a small incision cataract surgery during nucleus delivery, you may just lose a part of Descemet membrane detachment. So there is no point in waiting or doing a intervention where you have to observe it, because then the edema slowly resolves on its own. So the earlier the better. You don't have to wait for too long. There's nothing like long standing post surgery, and it gives gratifying results post bubbling. So it's always better for the patients, because the patients ultimately want vision, and so the earlier you do, the better chances of the corneal edema resolving.
Okay.
Do I have time for one more question?
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Puneet.
Yeah, one last question
Fortunately,
to both.
we don't have any session in this hall right now, so we have some time, then we can continue with this.
Okay, so I have one question for both Dr. Nupur and Dr. Lakshmi. There are these patients, who come from rural background. It's really difficult to get them to do a perimetry. The maximum you can try is 2 attempts in a day. After that, they're exhausted and they won't do it. So you have these, cup disc ratio, which is looking around 0.4 to 0.5-ish, maybe a notch, doubtfully a notch. And you don't have a conclusive this thing. You have an IOP, which is around 20 and 21. So, I mean, what do you do in such a situation? Do you go ahead clinically? Do we get an OCT done to corroborate it? And is the OCT enough even once it's perimetric also, not pre-perimetric stage? Once you come to the perimetric stage also, is the OCT enough to help in diagnosis, or what do you suggest?
So what I do generally in such cases is I get a baseline perimetry done. Always I get a baseline perimetry. For the next time we have a learning curve. Next time they may do better. So just to introduce them to the test, I get a perimetry. Then I always get a central corneal thickness corrected IOP, always. And ASOCT. If we have an OCT machine, ASOCT gives better results as compared to that. If it's in the early 20s, like 21, 22, if it's wavering with that, and RNFL OCT shows maybe 1 point of yellow area and nothing else, then I wait for 2 months. 2 months later, I repeat only the OCT and see if there is any progression in the numbers. Therein lies the importance of those numbers in the graph, the pie chart and clock hour graph. If there is any difference in numbers, if it's increasing, even then you can see the average, like the average of all the numbers. If it's the same, you don't need to start the treatment right away. You don't need to worry. Glaucoma is a slow disease with long progression. It doesn't change in 1 or 2 months generally. So I ask them to come back after 2 months. If there is not much change, I keep a close follow-up. But at the same time, if we know they come from villages and they're not going to turn up back again, and I'm extremely suspicious of glaucoma. I have maybe superior and inferior thinning in the RNFL OCT, and it's not possible for me to get uh, HVF. Then in the progression, if it shows a little bit of progression also in about 2 or 4 months time, I generally start the patient on AGMs. That's what I follow generally, and that's what most books say also. What do you think, Dr. Nupurana?
So what I usually do is, ideally, best case scenario is to get an OCT, a central corneal thickness, and visual fields done at the time of the first diagnosis. Now, in pre-parametric glaucomas, obviously OCT is a much better method to compare. The other thing you mentioned was that you're talking about rural patients. So sometimes these patients may not be willing to get a disc photo done. What you can do is draw a small diagram on your own, showing how the vessels are moving, and write a detailed description of the disc. So even if the patient is not willing to pay for any of these investigations, you have something to compare with during your follow-up evaluations. The second thing is always look at the corrected IOP and not the patient's baseline IOP. And another thing, if possible, also do a diurnal variation test for these patients. So I like to see what is the highest pressure that this patient has, and then based on that, how does the disc look? And if I feel the patient will come to me for a regular follow-up, maybe we can defer the treatment or wait and watch. But if I feel this patient is an old patient who will most probably come today and he'll probably come to me after 3 years, 4 years, once he becomes completely blind, then I start an AGM for the patient.
Yeah, the diurnal variation test, I generally take 3 values and a difference of 5. If it is there, I take it as significant. Even though the book says difference of 6, I have seen in my practice that 4 or 5 difference is quite significant and it progresses. In GPA analysis testing, it progresses quite well, quite a lot, and quite fast. So if there is DVT of 5 or more, I would like to I would like to think of starting on AGMs.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lakshmi, Dr. Nupur, Dr. Puneet, Kirti, Dr. Ronak, for your valuable time. I would request Dr. Nupur to quickly conclude the entire session in her words. So we can.
Thank you very much. I thank all my co-instructors and the chairpersons and the moderators for their valuable time. I hope we were helpful in throwing some light on how to read these charts, and hopefully everyone who has attended, the next time you see a chart from a different subspecialty, you won't quickly take a picture and send it to your friend, but at least attempt to report it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.